everyone. Welcome to our third session for the day. Our topic this time is implications of digital finance. My name is Anton Didenko. I'm the senior lecturer at the University of New South Wales Faculty of Law and Justice. And before we start the session, I would like to thank the Australian government for making this event happen, and also our gracious hosts, Wood Mallesons. It just occurred to me that this is precisely the same room in which we teach one of the very important courses at the university, and I needed to resist the temptation to start this panel by saying, "Good morning, class." We have 4 distinguished speakers today. One of them is joining us online remotely. And these speakers don't really require an introduction. I will introduce them before they all start their presentations. We will be tackling 2 very important issues. We had so much to, we could talk about so many things as part of this session, digital finance. And I think it connects very well to the previous discussions because finance is an enabler of trade. And we decided to focus on 2 major issues. One is the cross-border implications of central bank digital currencies. Ross and Urszula will be speaking to that topic. And also, then we will have the second block of the 2 presenters talking about the tokenizing real-world assets and the underlying technological and legal challenges. So without further ado, let's start with our first presenter, and that would be Ross Buckley. Ross Buckley is Scientia Professor and Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow at the University of New South Wales Faculty of Law and Justice. He is a member of the Payment System Board at the Reserve Bank of Australia and chairs Digital Finance Advisory Panel and serves on the consultative panel of ASIC. I can vouch for that. He's one of the most downloaded scholars of all time on the Social Sciences Research Network, which might be due in no small part to me downloading his papers several times a week. Over to you, Ross.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad. I gave Anton a job a long time ago on condition he sat up every night downloading my papers at home, and I'm glad to hear he's kept his word. But central bank digital currencies, the only central bank money you have access to is cash, right? All of the digital money you use is promises of commercial banks. Now, the cash issue is interesting. There's $4,000, over $4,000 of cash on issue for every Australian. So if you have 500 of it, somebody else has 7,500 of it. So it's somewhere. The Reserve Bank doesn't really know where it is. The cash usage is falling through the floor. Cash issuance in response to demand is going up every year. So something interesting is going on, but we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about CBDCs, which put central bank money into the hands of businesses and into the hands of individuals. They do a lot of things really well. In a digital world, they interact with smart contracts really well. They provide settlement finality because they're central bank money. You can program them. You can build escrows and all that sort of stuff into the very currency or into the wrapper around the currency. So they're a very interesting development. The global debate on them is quaint and confused, I would say. I participate in international discussions all over the place. If you talk to Americans, they can really only talk about a retail CBDC, partly, I think, because their retail payment systems are not nearly as good as ours, but also because they have a weird relationship to the dollar, right? Americans have a truly weird relationship to their currency. For the Europeans, they mostly talk about a retail CBDC because they hate the idea with cash usage declining that their payment systems will be run by 2 American corporations, MasterCard and Visa. So that's a sovereignty problem for the Europeans, so they like the idea of it. Australia is looking at it. We ran an event early this year at the RBA where we put philosophers, historians, economists, various other social scientists in a room for a day to explore, what a retail CBDC would look like. And it was a wonderful day because we came away with a strong conviction we didn't know nearly enough. We needed a whole lot more research. This is a really complicated topic. One of the big learnings of the day was that one way to sum it up is sitting on level 61, looking at that view, is probably about the worst place in the world to try to assess the case for a retail CBDC, right? Because my guess is almost nobody here today is using cash or carrying cash. But for the parts of the community that use cash, it's really, really important. And one of the problems for a retail CBDC is if it gets launched, it'll take cash usage further down. It'll replace, it'll make it harder to get cash out to people. And if you've been following the Fin or the Sydney Morning Herald, we've got a cash distribution problem looming in this country, the Armaguard story. It's becoming very difficult in an economic sense to actually distribute cash because the costs are pretty well fixed. The usage is going down, so the economics doesn't make sense anymore. So there's a lot of, all of that is by way of introduction to say there's a lot of issues with a retail CBDC. I don't think there's nearly so many issues with a cross-border payments wholesale CBDC. I personally think it's a no-brainer. I've just written my first sole authored article in 8 years on this topic. I'm not sure why I did that. I think it was to prove to myself I could still do it without somebody like Anton holding my left hand. And I did, so I'm rather pleased with myself. But the reason that the cross-border usage is the no-brainer is that this is where the inefficiencies are, right? The average cost for corporations paying across borders at the moment is 1.5%, according to the Financial Stability Board. So 1.5 percentage points and often 2 days for the transaction to happen. The finance minister of Brazil a couple of years ago quipped that the cheapest, fastest way to make a payment between Sao Paulo and London was to get onto a plane with a suitcase shoved full of the stuff and fly up there. He was joking, obviously, because it's illegal, but he was probably right on the cost and the speed, and that's crazy, right, in the modern world. Why can we do instantaneous payments within Australia now with OSCO and the new payments platform, and we can't do it across borders? It's even more egregious at the bottom end in remittances, where in our part of the world, Pacific Islanders are working in Australia, sending money back to Samoa or Tonga or Fiji. Tonga and Samoa are two of the most remittance-dependent countries in the world. The global average on remittances is 6.3%. The average in our region is about 8%. So that's like a massive tax. If you're an islander, you're working here, you want to send $500 home to your family, it's going to cost you $40 to send $500 home. Even if the bank you're with here and the bank they're with in Fiji is the same bank, right? This is appalling. And I've been banging this drum for years and got absolutely nowhere because the islanders who send money home from Australia aren't the same islander people who vote in Australia, so it's hard to get political traction on it. But a 1% reduction in remittance fees globally would put $6 billion a year into the pockets of poor people. That's a 1% reduction, and the fees, the average globally at the moment, worse in our part of the world, the average is 6.3%. So this is, I think, where CBDCs could make a huge difference. The actual details I'll leave to Urszula on my left, because she was the legal mastermind behind MBridge, which is still going on, isn't it? A sort of a hub system to facilitate transfers and bring central banks together and facilitate transfers in CBDCs. But the interesting thing about this whole field, I think, is people focus a lot on how to build it. And I don't think that's the difficult thing. Clever technologists like Mark sitting at the end, he wakes up in the morning, he can build you a CBDC in a few hours, right? He's nodding, he's looking knowledgeable. I've got a PhD student in the RBA at the moment, and it's sort of embedded in there. And I assumed, because she's a lawyer, the RBA would want her to look at the legal issues around a CBDC. But when we had the early discussions, their response was, well, we don't have to worry about that. We're the Reserve Bank. If we don't have the authority, we'll get it, right? If we need a new act, we'll get it. That's not interesting. The interesting thing to them is, how do you govern a multilateral CBDC arrangement? how do you govern the relations between the countries so that CBDCs can be used for international trade in an efficient way? So that's what Mia Trzynski's working on, looking at the current governance models around the world for things like SWIFT and other, CLS Bank and others, and trying to work out what we can adapt for that for this new world. Because I think CBDCs are coming for cross-border payments. They're not, there's two ways you can do it. You can link fast payment systems. So we've got a fast payment system in Australia now. You could link that with other nations' fast payment systems and send money abroad that way, or you could use CBDCs. Fast payment systems generally, though, I don't think will accommodate the amounts of money needed for international trade transactions. So I suspect iron ore payments between Australia and China probably won't operate through fast payment systems. They'll probably operate through CBDCs. The other thing, though, is that China is pivotal, to my mind, in all of this. And Urszula can speak more knowledgeably than I can on it. But on a global perspective, China's for about 12 years, 14 years, has been trying to claw back some of the exorbitant privilege the US gets. The US gets an enormous number of benefits from minting the predominant global reserve currency, right? Exchange rate risk goes away on most of their international transactions, cost of borrowing goes down, all sorts of benefits. I think it was Valerie Giscard d'Estaing in the 60s called it exorbitant privilege, and it's a very good description of all the benefits the US gets. China doesn't like this. China wants a world where there's 3 or 4 more balanced global reserve currencies, not one hegemon. And they've been working for it for 10 or 12 years, not making very much traction, mainly because of issues around trust. But CBDC gives them a new platform, right? CBDC, they're way ahead of anybody else in terms of their domestic CBDC at the moment. They're a long way further down the track. I think internationally, they will take the domestic CBDC, make it available for trade. They quite probably make it free. And they may well, in time, mandate its use. If you want to buy China's exports, you pay in this way. Importers probably won't worry about that because it's just you don't have to keep the money in ECNY. You can swap it straight back out. It's just a instantaneous payment mechanism. But China will do all this, I think, without looking to make any profit out of it at all, because it's not a profit-driven operation. It's a change the international financial architecture game. And if China's done one thing really well in the last 30 years, it's shown it has the ability to think really long-term and act really long-term and act consistently over long periods. So, and also remember, from China's point of view, after the Industrial Revolution, the pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Before and after World War II, the US dollar was the global reserve currency because the US was the major factory of the world, but China's been the major factory for the world for 20 years. And the international architecture hasn't adapted to the sort of trade architecture. So I think CBDCs will be what are used to facilitate trade in the future. I think we'll go from 1 to 2 days to often 1 to 2 hours. We'll go from 1.5 percentage points to a few basis points. The economics of it are overwhelming. And as I say, it's not really the technology. There's a lot of negotiations, a lot of legal work, a lot of bringing entities, central banks together in hubs and all that, getting all the rules aligned, but that's all quite doable. So I think we'll get there. And I think one of the reasons virtually every major central bank in the world at the moment is piloting, researching, or trying to build one of these things. It's quite extraordinary. Almost nobody wants to be the leader. Nearly everybody wants to be a fast follower. The Reserve Bank's view is we want to be a fast follower, which I get. But if everybody wants to be a fast follower, who do you follow? My money is we'll end up following China because China will go first. But that's enough from me.
Thank you so much, Ross. I think there was an excellent introduction into the cross-border benefits and implications of a CBDC, as well as into the benefits of, rather unexpectedly, locking a bunch of scholars in the same room for an extended period of time to solve the issues associated with the CBDC. Now let's go into some more detail and talk about the Australia-China specific initiatives in cross-border CBDCs. And our next speaker is Urszula McCormack. Urszula is a partner at King & Wood Mallesons, our gracious hosts. Today, she is a regulatory and digital economy specialist focusing on emerging technologies. She has helped pioneer the creation of one of Asia Pacific's most respected fintech practices and runs a large cross-border team based in Australia and Hong Kong. Over to you, Urszula.
Thank you, and what a fantastic introduction, Ross, to the topic. My aim today is to talk quite specifically around some of the nuts and bolts of the initiatives in Australia and China across these four areas: issuance, extraterritorial applications, cross-border infrastructure and experimentation, and protective mechanisms, which I'll describe. And the reason that issuance itself isn't necessarily cross-border, but it's super relevant to a lot of the initiatives that we're seeing in these markets. Ross has mentioned mainland China, incredibly well advanced. The ECNY is a structure, it's infrastructure that's been led by the Digital Currency Institute of the People's Bank of China. And actually, we work with them a lot on mBridge as well. Incredible contributions to the development of the thinking around CBDCs. ECNY has a tiered access. So you can use ECNY in small amounts with relatively modest levels of KYC, right through to sort of full-blown KYC and controls and parameters when higher value transactions are involved. But basically leverages a permissioned system. So not everybody can, use it as you might say Ether or Bitcoin. It is through that tiered access model. And on top of that, there is a heavy involvement of the domestic banks in issuance and distribution. And that is a theme that's coming up time and time again, is to preserve the role of commercial banks in an appropriate way in CBDCs. With a part of China, obviously, is Hong Kong. Hong Kong does have an EHKD. 2 pilots, retail were last year, wholesale coming up this year, but experimentation in EHKD. So for the time being, at least, the Hong Kong dollar is intended to be preserved. And as many of you would know, the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar. So that's relevant. Now, on the Australian side, and I'll come to talk about ECNY in Hong Kong. In Australia, we had the wholesale experiment with Project Atom, which was in relation to syndicated lending, and then the pilots that occurred last year to test whether or not there were retail use cases. And I think, like Ross, I enjoy the philosophical dialogue, and some people will raise that actually, perhaps it is just like the creation of, a smartphone where the applications came over time. And what I really like, there's an OECD paper that talks about cash as public infrastructure, as Ross also described, the direct access to public money. And I do like the idea of modernizing cash and preserving it as public infrastructure, and not necessarily hunting for every possible use case before launch. But in any case, EAUD is perhaps on par with or perhaps a little bit behind EHKD. Now, in general, we see in both Hong Kong and Australia insufficient compelling use cases for it to be launched. That's the conclusion of both those reports. And obviously there's different push and pull factors. I was driving back, we took our children camping in the Snowy Mountains over the Easter break. We stopped off at Marulan, and on the back of the door, there was, in the bathroom was, inscribed in bright pink, no to digital identity, no to central bank digital currencies. And there's this really strong distrust of that here. And I would say that that's perhaps less so in Hong Kong, but there's a lot of projects to really focus on privacy preserving techniques. So it's not off the charts. And I think that's an assumption that's wrongly made about mainland China too, that people don't care about their privacy. That really couldn't be further from the truth. But in any case, under ongoing development, and I think we've had the announcement from the Treasury and the RBA that there'll be further experimentation in Australia. But let's go to talk about the extraterritorial applications of a domestic CBDC. And this is where, again, ECNY is the most advanced. And it's been testing the application of ECNY in the Hong Kong market, both from a functional perspective, but also linking with the faster payment system. And the idea is not necessarily to replace the Hong Kong dollar, and that's really important, but that if I'm traveling from mainland China, I come across the border, say from Shenzhen, I want to go and pay for some dim sum, I can do so with my ECNY, but the vendor, the shop, still gets Hong Kong dollars. So it's not intended to start accounts held in Hong Kong in ECNY, and that's really important. It's still infrastructure to connect the two. On the flip side, there's also been experiments, particularly with the Asian Games, to do the opposite, so that Hong Kong residents can go to mainland China, pay for their hotel rooms, and actually have access to one of those permissioned ECNY accounts. And that's really, really relevant from not so much just the flow of cash cross-border, but it's the flow of people as well, and commerce. So that experimentation is going to continue. But certainly a lot of concern about that, and we'll see that in the protective mechanisms that we're seeing in other markets, where it's not necessarily been embraced in the same way, having ECNY circulating outside of mainland China. Now on the Australian side, and this is where Australia and China are operating in different circles. So Australia experimented with cross-border in Project Dunbar. It was a BIS related project, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But also in the EAUD pilots that happened last year, there were also some of the cross-border use cases, but generally I would say pretty minor. We had the testing by Canvas of just simply a settlement of USDC, so a US dollar reference stablecoin, so kind of not really cross-border. And then Maneuver received the CBDC, had an inbound settlement from offshore. So much lighter touch, but still some going on. I would say more of this is occurring in the stablecoin space. So NAB in particular trialed its stablecoin across a number of markets to see how it would move around. Now, from a technical perspective, and this is by far Mark's area, the technical aspects of that are not as challenging as some of the regulatory aspect. The technical stuff is super complex and important. But what I mean by that is just that, launching it in Australia from a technical perspective compared to launching it, and having access to it in Singapore is, and I'll ask Mark to comment on that, by and large, procedurally much the same, but regulatory very different. Now let's talk about cross-border infrastructure and experimentation, certainly a passion of mine. And you'll see the Bank for International Settlements publishing all the time about projects that it's doing. It had 12 last year, it's got 6 in the pipeline this year. And the reason that you see BIS all the time is that it sits at the fulcrum of central banks. It was established after the Second World War to assist with reparations moving around, and it still plays a really critical role. Whether it plays a role in settlements is still a topic, I think, for BIS to decide. But in any case, a lot of these are out of the innovation hubs from the BIS. And as I said, Australia's been playing in different, let's say, sandpits compared to China, which I think and would hope may well change. So as I mentioned, Project Dunbar was what Australia had done. That was with Malaysia, Singapore and South Africa with 2 prototypes. So technical prototypes. Mbridge is very different. Mbridge is a platform that's still about settlement, and I'll talk about what it actually does, but it involves mainland China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the UAE, different circle, and it's probably the closest platform to production. It's done live value tests and pilot, and it's now in MVP phase. And really the idea is, just to put it really simply, is that it is a piece of code, like technology, it's code, that enables a digital representation of a claim against one central bank to move from one participant to another. What that means in practice, and it also allows atomic swaps or transfers one against the other. But importantly, it needs to, and this ties into Ross's point around governance, it needs to be able to be under a common set of rules and yet preserve the sovereignty of each jurisdiction to be able to issue its own asset, to define the rules of that asset and define the terms of use, define the terms upon which it can be redeemed against the central bank, because the central bank of the UAE is not going to want to trade with everybody else. It will want to really just have the relationship with its own central banks, but still have a sufficiently harmonized regime around it. The other complexity comes that if I'm selling a ship, let's say, I might be selling one across to Anton. Anton and I might use the platform, and we might go, great, we're subject to the same rules, but we'll still need a contract for the sale of the ship. So the other contracts are also important. And so some of the most complex things around these projects are choice of governing law. So which law are we all going to pick is going to rule it? And are we comfortable that then UAE will choose a different governing law for its own aspects? The other one is, in that sort of model, do we have an operator? Do we not have an operator? And if we don't have an operator, how does the flow of permissions all work? And how does change management occur? And then likewise, who's supervising the commercial participants that are on the platform? So lots of really juicy, meaty legal issues, but really exciting infrastructure because it helps solve that cross-border riddle. Now, finally, I'll just wrap with, just the final thing, I will say is that on experimentation is that what I particularly like about some of the projects is that they're testing and finding solutions for certain problems. So that was where Hong Kong participated in a project with Israel around Project Stellar, which was on cybersecurity. Hong Kong with Project Aurum, so just Hong Kong in this case, is looking at privacy enhancing features for CBDCs. And what I like about that is really honing in on the barriers to launching these things. Now, finally, to whiz through the protective mechanisms, these are all the things that some jurisdictions are doing to say, whoa, I'm not so sure about an offshore CBDC. And let's face it, generally they're thinking about ECNY. We're not so sure about that. So there's two pieces of legislation that were introduced by Republican senators in the US, one called the Say No to the Silk Road Act. Some of this just makes me, really grimace. But it required the State Department to issue a warning on the digital yuan, so very focused. Required reports on trade enforcement actions, and required that any foreign government that receives financial assistance through the US military disclose if they use ECNY either as a settlement or reserve currency. The second was called the Defending Americans from Authoritarian Digital Currencies Act. And that was really about the app store providers. And it was seeking to restrict them from carrying or supporting any app within the United States that supports or enables transactions in ECNY. And I'll let you guess what the most likely app they had in mind. But close to home, Australia had its own proposals by Senator Bragg, tacked on to the end of a proposal which has been rejected, Digital Assets Market Regulation Bill, which had a different approach. And that wasn't only targeted at ECNY, but it was focused on reporting by banks. So the banks would have to report the number of businesses that have accepted payments using certain CBDCs in relation to accounts held with the ADI, number of digital wallets, total sums, and then public reporting. So shot down, but I think that at least the Australian one was more just understanding how much of it was circulating, which you could imagine is to a degree a fair perspective. So with that, I will pause. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Urszula. The lawyer in me relates to the creativity of the US lawmakers in developing new legislation to ban things they don't really like. I think an equally terribly named piece of legislation was proposed back when Facebook came up with Libra. The idea was to ban all the digital platforms to launch and to offer offer payments. So on CBDCs, we've had a very interesting discussion. I have many questions, but I will pause my questions until the Q&A session after all the presentations. And now, unless Mark, do you want to respond to Urszula's point on the relative simplicity of launching from a technology perspective?
Maybe two brief comments then. One is when we did our CBDC project with the Reserve Bank last year, the cross-border use cases were put out of scope as part of the definition of the project. So we did have some cross-currency exchanges, but they weren't meant to be cross-border. So, and on I guess lawyers might think when dealing with technical challenges that it's just a matter of engineering. But I guess from an engineer's point of view, when dealing with legal problems, it's just a matter of paperwork. So, but in fact, they're not kind of separate. The kind of paperwork you need to do is very much tied in with the kind of engineering you need to do and vice versa. So they're kind of interlinked challenges.
Thank you, Mark. And so now I need to introduce this wonderful speaker, who's our, I think he's one of the more distinguished experts in technology we can think of. We are very lucky to have Mark with us. This is Mark Staples, who is the Chief Technology Officer for the Digital Finance Cooperative Research Center, DFCRC, and a Senior Principal Researcher in Data 61 at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization. Last year, the RBA, the central bank in Australia, and the DFCRC launched a project on central bank digital currency, EAUD, and Mark led the technology stream for that project. Mark represents Australia on the ISO Blockchain and Distributed Ledger Technology Standards Committee. And if you have any questions relating to technology in our Q&A session, please direct them at Mark. Mark's topic would be to discuss another issue that has exploded recently in popularity, and that is tokenizing real-world assets and the underlying technology and risks. Over to you, Mark.
All right, thanks very much. So tokenizing real-world assets, the underlying technology and risks. So mostly, in fact, what I'm going to talk about is tokenization to start with, and then I'll get into digital tokens and look at some of the risks for both of those. So here we go. So I'll start. What is a token? So tokenization is a very old technology. We are all very familiar with tokens. Movie tickets are tokens, plane tickets are tokens, casino chips are tokens, bond certificates and their little coupons are all tokens of various sorts. And the whole financial system used to run on a tokenized basis until the shift to central registration of securities with digitization. So there are all sorts of different tokens. They all have this kind of common thing, which is a token is something you can hold or control personally as an individual. You're meant to not be able to copy it, so they're meant to be kind of, not falsifiable. And if you give them to other people, you can't keep a copy for yourself. But every token is a little transferable object that represents some sort of rights or entitlements that you have. And those rights or entitlements are usually established by the issuer when they created the token in the first place. So the rights can be all sorts of things. That can be authorization or license, or maybe reflect ownership, perhaps, in some sort of underlying property, or ownership of money, maybe. There might be financial products. So a bond is a token that's a financial product. And the rights that are attached to the token are defined by each of the issuers. So looking at these tokens, the pictures up here, you'll see some interesting differences. Like, so you see the casino chips in the middle. They're reusable. I can, take a casino chip and gamble, and then go to another table and gamble again. But the plane ticket on the top right, that's not reusable. That's a use once token. I can use it for one particular flight. The one on the top is tied to me as an individual, so it's not even meant to be transferable. But the movie ticket is, some of those are like movie tickets, if they have a seat number on them, they're not really interchangeable with another movie ticket because it'll be a different seat. But a lot of, if you go to the old cinemas, they're all interchangeable. There's no seat numbers. So they're what we call fungible tokens. Another interesting thing about all these tokens is what they represent is not really written on the token. Maybe it is in the case of the bond certificates, but the casino chips, the movie tickets, there's nothing written on it that says this chip, this token represents all the various entitlements. So the fact that it represents those entitlements has to be established somewhere else, somehow else. What do standards and regulators say tokens are? I've picked up the ISO standard from Blockchain and Distributed Ledger Technology, which defines a token as an asset that represents a collection of entitlements. That's very consistent with what I said on the previous slide. There's a proposal paper on regulating digital asset platforms that's come out from the Australian Treasury last year, and they're apparently going to do another round of consultation. They say a token can be held by a person and is hard to counterfeit, and that has entitlements that flow because you hold the token, and that the entitlement can be any sort of right. So that's very consistent with what I said before. A token's a thing you can have, control it, give it to other people. Even if you give the token to other people, doesn't mean that the rights attached to the token also go to the other person, but very often they do, depending on the token. Here's a picture. Hopefully this animation works. We've got an issuer, and they start by being able to issue some sort of entitlements or rights to people, and they're what we call backing those entitlements or rights. They can then create a token, which in the online world is called minting a token, and then they can sell that token or transfer it to someone else, a primary owner, and that process is called issuing the token. That primary owner, perhaps if they're allowed to, if it's a transferable right, might sell or transfer the token to some secondary owner in a secondary market. It can be called transferring the token. And then at some point, the secondary owner might sell it to other secondary owners, but eventually, very often, they'll redeem the token back to the issuer. Sometimes this is called burning, or the issuer might burn the token on redemption. And at that point, the entitlements that they were backing for the token are given to the secondary owner who redeemed it. So this is a kind of very simple sort of flow of the life cycle of a token, and how it relates to the entitlements that are backing the token. So what I've done here is overlay all sorts of risks related to tokenization. So can the issuer back the entitlements on all the tokens they've issued, not just this particular one? Are the entitlements issuable in the first place? So a property right over land in Australia is not really issuable because it needs to be a registrable right, for example. Can the entitlements change over time? When the primary holder is buying the token, do they know what the entitlements are? How would they work that out? Because it's maybe not written on the token. Are they allowed to transfer the title to someone else or not? How do they transfer the token? If they hold the token, can it be taken from them? What if they lose the token? Can they ask someone for a copy to get it back or not? And when it comes to the secondary holder sending the token back, is the issuer actually going to honour the entitlements? So all of these are kind of risks or questions related to tokenization. But nothing I've said at the moment is really about digital tokens. So all of these kind of risks and process flows apply to paper tokens as much as digital tokens. So click. To go on. Okay. So what about digital tokens? So Bitcoin, we started financial, as I said at the start, the financial system started with paper tokens largely. It ran through paper tokens. And then when we digitized stuff, we moved to central securitized, central registers of securities. There was this long-standing problem in computer science called the problem of digital cash, which is this challenge of how can you have like coins, which could be money or could be tokens, that like physical cash, I can directly hold it myself and I can directly give it to other people. It's not like bank money. For bank money, I have to ask my bank to do that. I don't have direct control over it, right? But bank money has the advantage that you can send it to remote parties, whereas for physical cash, you need to be in the same, shop or parking lot. So this challenge of digital cash is, can you have a digital instrument that I can directly control, but I can still give it to remote parties? And Bitcoin was kind of one of the, was the first sort of major platform that had a new kind of solution to this challenge of digital cash. But it's not just kind of Bitcoins that this enables, this idea of having blockchains creating transferable digital tokens. The ownership of the token is established by visibility around this global ledger. and you authorize and control and hold tokens by using cryptographic mechanisms to establish your kind of ownership or control over the tokens. Digital tokens are different to physical tokens. As I said before, like I can't give a casino chip to someone on the other side of the world, but I could send a digital token to someone on the other side of the world. So that's the kind of digital cash advantage. But they're also natively digital, and so computer programs can operate on them. So I can write programs that do automation, and that automation can apply directly to these digital tokens. But they also give us the benefit of not just being able to transfer, one token from me to you on the other side of the world, but also they support the ability to do safe purchase, to kind of eliminate counterparty risk in the purchase of tokens. And that's, so if you have two tokens that are on the same ledger, and maybe one's a token for cash and one's a token for some other asset, then you can have a single database transaction that does an atomic swap of those. And that becomes and if one of them is a money token, then that's a purchase. The money might be CBDC, might be a stablecoin, or a tokenized bank deposit, or cryptocurrency, but you can get this atomic settlement. So there are a couple of additional risks here with digital tokens, like risks around the underlying token platform. Is that going to be stable and secure? And there's risks around cryptographic key management for the control of the tokens as well. That's something that's usually not done very well. And the different mechanisms are required for seizing tokens or whatever, if required by courts, for example. There is another difference, which is that digital tokens can have behaviors. So they can do stuff themselves, basically, or do stuff in while they're being acted on. So we often implement digital tokens on blockchains, and that's often done these days by using what are called smart contracts, which are just kind of little programs that run on the ledger. Digital tokens can have data. Paper tokens can have data too. They can have serial numbers written on the little coupons you tear off, that kind of data. But digital tokens can also have behavior. And so digital tokens can try and restrict their transfer. They could initiate other subsidiary actions when they are transferred. Issuers could limit how many times they could be transferred, or they could create other kind of special limitations on transfer in terms of the around the total value of the transfer might be limited, or the aggregate transfers in a day from an address. All of that are programmable conditions that we can attach. And so now the tokens, they don't just have entitlements, but they also have behaviors. And the question then is, there are, for the digital token, there are additional risks. So when you have programs, you have bugs. So you've got to start thinking, oh, what bugs do I have in my token? Is its behavior going to be incorrect? If I have token behaviors, are they going to interfere with my ability to control the token in the way I want to? And are the token behaviors consistent with the entitlements that are meant to be issued by the issuer? So the issuer might say this is not a transferable token, not a transferable right, but the token might be transferable, or vice versa. So are those two things, aligned? And just as the entitlements for a token are not usually written on the token, these behaviors are not written in the entitlements, and they're often very hard to review and understand what the behaviors are going to be. Okay, so almost getting near the end. I was meant to talk about tokenized real-world assets. And so really, tokenized assets are almost always all real-world assets. It's hard to find one that's not a real-world asset. But you could say that cryptocurrencies are tokens that don't have an issuer and don't have an entitlement, and they don't have any backing. They can still have value and be used, but they're kind of not real-world assets in the sense that they're purely digital. And so building from there, we could imagine this world of purely digital tokens, where these are tokens that are issued with no entitlements at all, or meme coins, for example, or purely digital tokens that only have automated issuance and redemption for cryptocurrencies and other purely digital tokens. So they're sort of entirely in their own little digital ecosystem. I would say a real-world asset token is any kind of token that's not one of those, which is, in a sense, most traditional tokens that we've had in the world are real-world tokens. And they can represent, just like other tokens, the normal entitlements that we see in the financial system for financial assets, physical assets, intellectual assets. And again, it's even for physical objects. It's people sometimes think, oh, I'm tokenizing a car. It's not the car. It's not the physical object that's being tokenized. What's being tokenized are the rights in relation to the car. It might be a property right, or it might be a commercial lease right, or whatever it is. But it's not the physical object that's being tokenized. So summary, tokens, they can be held and not copied. They have entitlements that are backed by issuers. There's a whole lot of normal token risks that are very well understood. Digital tokens, you can send them to other people around the world, and you have direct control over that yourself. Plus, they can be acted on by computers, and they can have behaviors as well. And so there's a few additional risks with digital tokens as well. And finally, tokenized real-world assets are where the entitlements are, not just purely digital, but things we care about in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mark, I think this serves as an excellent introduction of an accessible introduction into such a difficult from the perspective from a technology side of things. And now I think that we have a basic understanding of the related technology. Let us switch on to discussing the legal and regulatory angle and legal regulatory implications of tokenized real-world assets. And our final fourth presenter joining us online is Joni Pirovich. Joni is the principal at Blockchain and Digital Asset Services and Law. She's a specialist advisor for crypto, tokenization, and Web3 projects in Australia and around the world. And she contributes to crypto policy efforts globally, including her current positions with the Law Commission of England and Wales, DAO Advisory Panel, Regulatory Interoperability Lead at DAO Star, and Deputy Chair of the Blockchain Australia Tax Working Group. So, Joni, please guide us through the legal and regulatory challenges of tokenized real-world assets.
Thank you. And I'll just do one more sound check to make sure I'm coming through okay. Great. A privilege to be here, and apologies I cannot be there in person. I have 15 minutes to get through legal and regulatory, which is a tall ask, but I will try. What I'm going to talk through the lens of today is a project that was done in 2021 and 2022. It was Convergence Tech was my client, and I was the lead counsel. It was a project funded by the federal government as part of their national blockchain pilot program. Some of you may already be familiar with it. But my client at the time got $3 million to experiment with how blockchain could be used to reduce the administrative and compliance burdens in I'd call it the excise tax system, but with a focus on alcohol producers and which could extend to other commodity producers and supply chains. And the goal was to see if blockchain could be used to ultimately make the whole process more transparent, affordable, reliable, but all the way through to all of the reporting to the ATO around excise taxes payable as and when the alcohol, or, to extend it, the commodity moves through the system and reporting obligations and tax obligations apply. So this, unfortunately, the disclaimer is Convergence Tech is now wound up because the level of focus required to deliver on a $3 million project over a 1-year span without follow-on funding from the federal government or a plan to implement this meant that the company had to be wound up. So an unfortunate lesson, and if there's anyone in the room that can take away that lesson, there's some great learnings in this project, and unfortunately the IP is going nowhere other than those who read the report, which I've linked in the Q&A. Hopefully the event organisers can share that around to everybody. But the project focused on a litre of alcohol, or a LAL, and that is what we can call the real world asset that was tokenized. And depending on the distiller or the producer, it might have been integration with an inventory management system, or something that was a standard software approach that came with onboarding onto this blockchain excise platform, if it was ultimately commercialized. So producers would be able to tokenize each litre of alcohol that they would produce at the time of production. And the token or the technology underlying it was such that when 100 litres of alcohol would go into a barrel, or 2 litres of alcohol would go into a bottle, the next tokenization step was essentially something like wrapping, where 2 LALs would form part of a non-fungible token. For anyone familiar with the standard, it was the 1155. It became an ERC 1155 at that point. Now, as the actual commodity, or the litres of alcohol, or the drums, or the bottles would move through the supply chain, the barcode on the relevant drum or the bottle would also be scanned and updated, and so that the real-time information could be reflected on the blockchain. And long story short, an Aussie dollar stablecoin was used at the time. ANZ's AUD DC was being used for the blockchain project. And in theory, the ATO would have a regulator wallet, which would receive the relevant amount of excise tax paid in the AUD DC at the time it moved through the supply chain. So this solution was built, it was tested, it was proven, it was going, all of the numbers are in the report that I've linked on how much each of the businesses could get back in time and in money for not having to manually produce these reports as they tracked the supply chains and had all of the reconciliation effort and delays going on. Except, so the technology was there. It was proved it could be done. The economic and the business case, the pros were all there. But on the legal and the regulatory side, I think more than 10% of this report that went to government dealt with the reform that was needed to really to realise this platform, or to get the regulatory clarity that was needed for each industry participant, as well as the government side, and particularly the administration of the excise tax system, to equally enjoy the commercial and the efficiency dividends of such a system. So in the report, we go through all of the amendments that would be required to the Excise Act of 1901, as well as particular recommendations on the Currency Act, insofar as whether a privately issued stablecoin can be treated as Australian currency or not. And that is relevant to the question of whether tax-related liabilities can be paid, which currently they must be paid in Australian currency. And so, ipso facto, if a stablecoin is not Australian currency, then we don't get the efficiency dividend for the government side of lifting up an industry or a digital trade industry with the benefit of using a blockchain and tokenization and sensors and so forth. And some of the regulatory reform required, again, I'll speak to it at a high level, but the report is linked, so you can look at all of the section references and the acts. But there's in Australia still a question of what is a privately issued stablecoin characterised as, and if it is some sort of regulated product, be it a financial product or purchase payment facility, and mind you, we're dealing with existing law. I'm very aware of all of the great reforms that have been suggested, but that are not in place yet. So just the commercial, when you step back to the commercial, to try to raise funds on the promise of good law or good reform that is coming, it really impacts your ability to launch a platform in a particular time and get the return on the investment for the investors. And that is certainly something that continues to tie up Australian innovation insofar as blockchain-based platforms for digital trade and tokenization have industry-wide benefits and perhaps administration of government benefits too. So there is this regulatory issue of whether stablecoins used to process automatic payments, whether that be tax or other payments in escrow, is an Australian currency and an Australian currency dealing. If it's not, if it's a financial product, then we get straight back into, is the platform is the platform operator operating some form of non-cash payment facility which is regulated, or some sort of managed investment scheme, or a financial market, or all of those things. I'm missing out purchase payment facility, but I think the audience can follow that there are a number of potential licenses that would be required of a platform operator if we're dealing with a stable coin that is regulated, but we don't have clear delineation of where the regulatory boundary stops. So what we've been talking about in a lot of the reform, the more narrowly focused reform about stablecoin issuers, is what should be the requirements upon the issuer. You know, a full reserve, what are the insurance requirements, what are the cybersecurity resilience requirements, and so forth. But what we're not up to yet, and Urszula was touching on this, and I'm sure has a lot more experience to talk to this in detail, is the holistic arrangements. So if a platform operator wants to integrate a stablecoin and rely on that stablecoin for all of the payments, whether it be closed loop or in some sense opened in part for aspects of DeFi and other loans that might, or funding and financing opportunities that might eventuate from the visibility and transparency of tokens and supply chains moving on chain. All of that becomes confused because despite that the stablecoin issuer may be regulated, does the platform operator experience an overlap in regulation because by virtue of having a financial product or a regulated product that the platform relies on, what are their licensing requirements? And that question certainly hasn't been resolved yet, and for the most part is really on these innovators and the potential platform operators or consortia participants even to figure out contractually how what level of standard they're wanting to hold each other to as the quid pro quo to be supporting this new platform. And Mark, as you heard, spoke to all of the technology features, but also risks that need to be considered as these things are being built. So my question is, what are the legal and regulatory implications of tokenizing real world assets for digital trade? And this case study, this project, which was done in 2021 and 2022, and I now speak before you in April 2024, none of that legal reform has happened to allow the tokenization of real world assets to support digital trade, to enhance and uplift industry, as well as the administration of government and the collection of taxes associated with whatever trade is being done digitally. So that's coming from a history of $3 million of funding to this particular project, no further follow-on funding to support it, and despite the cost benefits and savings and investment that had gone into the 3 million, and now we are in a position where we don't have clear line of sight with an election looming, how much of a priority clarifying the legal and regulatory items on tokenizing real world assets, when that's really going to land. And so what industry is left with, and I speak from my commercial perspective of mostly acting for a lot of the innovators that want to connect their industries and that want to reduce the compliance burdens, there's a high level of frustration here as to as good as they can get in replicating or digital twinning how the existing legislation works, and having the blockchain as a form of record to trace and track reliably. We can't really unlock those benefits until we get prioritized legal and tax reform together, so that the economic dividend or the efficiency dividend arrives to both industry and to government. So that's it. Unfortunately, I've only got a short time, but I wanted to use this time today with all of the important people on the panel and in the room to say we need to do better, and tokenizing real world assets is a fantastic opportunity. It's fueled by the certainty of privately issued stablecoins and CBDCs, but there's a lot more work ahead, and we need to help out our innovators by being more clear to our governments and oppositions on the exact state of legal and regulatory clarity needed. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joni. And thank you to all the speakers for sticking to time, which allows us to have a Q&A session. What we'll do is I have one question for each speaker, and then I'll open the floor for other questions, should there be any. First of all, let's start with you, Ross. You haven't spoken to us for a while. We have discussed two separate, but I think related topics in a sense. Central bank digital currencies, cross-border use, and tokenizing real-world assets. For businesses engaged in cross-border trade between Australia and China, which of the fields is the bigger disruptor?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anton. Am I on? Yeah. In the shorter term, I think CBDCs and revolution in the payment system. In the longer term, I think tokenization of real-world assets is going to change the way everything operates. I think it's going to change back office operations in big corporations. I can see all the information being attached to tokens. There's so many really boring jobs at the moment in corporations, sort of reconciling accounts and payments and all of that stuff. And tokenization, I think, will just allow all of that to be incredibly well automated. As money moves in response to title moving, so I think long term that's going to be the biggest one. But in the short term, I think a revolutionized international payment system is going to make a big difference.
Thank you so much, Ross. Let's go in the same order. Urszula, you mentioned the Bank for International Settlements and the fact that they're doing so much work. They have innovation hub centers all over the world now, seemingly. They started with just 3. Now there are so many of them. And it's very difficult to keep track. I think you mentioned that several reports are coming out and there's so much happening. So for those of us who are not tracking all of those projects, could you single out, say, one project that's being headed by the BIS in the cross-border CBDC space that anyone interested in doing cross-border trade between Australia and China should be particularly interested in and maybe follow in the future? Maybe there's a report coming out. So which is the more important one?
Yeah, I mean, look, you would expect me to say Enbridge, but only because it's not a closed club, and there's no, in principle, reason Australia could not participate in that, and that's just an obvious example. The other one to watch would be Project Agora, which is 7 markets. It includes neither mainland China or Australia. It's a collection of Europe, Japan, Mexico, and a few others. So it's 7. But why that's super interesting is because that's focused on really getting the private sector to build something. And a lot of us are watching that with great cynicism because we've gone through the days of trying to build shared KYC utilities. But why I think it's really important and one to watch is because this question of who builds and maintains that nice infrastructure to enable cross-border use cases is a really difficult political, geopolitical, and practical question. So even in Australia, with projects like Project Ligon and others, there's a real issue around vendor lock-in and also just, enabling interoperability of platforms. I suspect we'll land in a world of multiple platforms and hopefully that will build a much more resilient system. But I think that's a valuable one to watch, and again something that I would imagine would be capable of having the involvement of others in. But certainly, the most obvious would be Australia's participation in MBridge.
Thank you so much, Urszula.
Well, I was going to say, as somebody who's not involved with MBridge, I would back MBridge as well as the one to look at. And I would particularly argue against Dunbar because Australia was in that project. And if you go out to South Head, you'll see a little memorial to the wreck of the Dunbar. I don't know what Australia was doing naming a project involved in a shipwreck, but anyway, that's enough.
Thank you, Ross. And Urszula, the Project Agora, I think it was only publicly announced about a week ago.
Yeah, and look, I will say that all of the projects they're on one page, the BIS, and there's some really interesting ones coming up on quantum resilience of some of this infrastructure, also testing analytics, so the same sort of analytics we see in the crypto native space. But again, super interesting. So worth a browse.
Thank you, Urszula. Mark. Let's talk a little bit about technology.
Sure.
You had a lot of slides, and one of them used, and you mentioned this, the word atomic swap. You mentioned, and also atomic settlement as well. Right?
Just atomic settlement.
Atomic settlement. Okay.
Yeah.
So could you explain to the non-experts? I suppose I'm the only non-expert in the room, so can you explain it to me in simple terms? How is it different? Because I hear the word atomic settlement usually in the context of blockchain distributed ledgers. So how is this atomic settlement, different from, say, ordinary settlement on a stock exchange? Yep. And do we really need this blockchain DLT technology to enable it, or can it exist outside by itself?
Yeah. Okay, lots of questions. So settlement is a kind of a legal concept about ending obligations in an agreement. And we're talking about purchase agreements for an asset, and you're going to give someone the asset, they're going to give you the money. And so settlement is about discharging both of those obligations. And atomic settlement is usually described as where settlement happens where it's not possible to exchange one leg without the other leg also being exchanged. And in normal, settlement in financial systems, that's what settlement is supposed to be. It's supposed to be, you give the shares, you get the money, and that's what settlement is. But I think the difference is that when we're talking about DVP settlement in traditional markets, there's kind of legal obligations and lots of technical mechanisms that are all there trying to make sure it happens. And maybe there's someone backing the risk in case it doesn't happen as a central counterparty or something. I'm not sure. But I think when we say atomic settlement, what we mean is it's physically impossible for these two things not to happen. It's a physical inevitability that either they're both going to settle or not. So it's getting beyond the sort of just there being a legal obligation in both directions, and lots of business best effort to try and make it happen, to be, you just can't do one without the other.
That relies on software working, right?
So if there's a bug,
but if the software doesn't work, then the settlement doesn't happen, right? Unless there's some particularly egregious kind of bug. But yes,
So the software can't fail in such a way that one side operates and the other side doesn't.
That's right.
You're confident of that.
That databases have been doing atomic database transactions since the 70s. That's very well understood. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mark. Yep, we have Mark's guarantee, stamp of approval. And my last question is for Joni. Actually, I think I probably can guess the answer, but I will still ask. Just thinking about the history, how much time it has taken the technology to develop. Look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin is 15 years old. In a few years, it will be old enough to drink under Australian laws. And we've had different projects, law reform proposals, and so on. But what exactly has been done in the law by now? So I would ask you, Joni, can you rate the regulatory framework on the scale from 1 to 10 currently in Australia for tokenized real-world assets, where 1 is non-existent, inaccessible, terrible framework that just doesn't work at all, or maybe a lack of any framework, and 10 is the perfectly operational, functional framework with full legal clarity?
Oh, that's a tough one to close. I think I'll claim my lawyer privileges and say it depends. But what I would say is that not having regulatory clarity doesn't stop you from experimenting now and in Australia, and networking, talking to the regulators, testing things so that the back office is ready as soon as that regulatory clarity is handed down. And there's a lot of testing that can be done in Australia. Perhaps not the full anticipated solution, but parts of it, so that you graduate into your readiness for tokenization of real world assets that leaps into perhaps a high growth phase of interaction with DeFi and interaction with other jurisdictions and governments. So we get this globalized sense of tokenized trade in digital assets. So I would say capital raising and turning any capital raise into a commercial venture that can launch to the public is the difficult part in Australia. And my more worldly client base is looking to people like Urszula in Hong Kong, who are leading tokenization of real world assets as it integrates with the on-ramps of getting stablecoin money into those funding flows. And so we're very lucky to have people like Urszula across Hong Kong and Australia, because it gives us the best of both worlds. And I would encourage anybody who doesn't know her to start talking to her if you want to start raising capital and doing that kind of project readiness, so that you can launch with gusto in Australia or scale to Australia in the next 2 to 3 or maybe 10 years.
Thank you, Joni. I think there was a vaguely disguised 1 on the scale, but that's just my interpretation. Don't quote me on that.
Thank you.
So I promised that I said I had 1 question for all speakers. I lied. I have a lot more, but I'll open the floor for questions from the audience, whether law related, technology related, or anything related to those people who are locked in the same room talking about CBDCs previously. Any questions from the audience? Or online? Right. No, wonderful. Then I will take, now, what, please. Can we give the microphone?
Thanks for the panel. It's very informative. Yeah, we're talking about, like Judy, talking about the Hong Kong market lead, the market crypto and technologizations like a market lead, but they also had a huge crime in last 3 years. It's like a triple. The Australian government legislation, Department of Authorization or Financial Authority learn from them?
Look, let me briefly comment on that. So what we've seen happen in Hong Kong is it's always been a really buzzy ecosystem. Tether grew up out of Hong Kong. We've had a lot of great, and interesting platforms and ideas, and it's a real collision of ideas constantly. There's been a few things that have come through Hong Kong. There was the JPEX, issue. There was influencers who were plugging this platform that effectively ran away with everybody's money. but also a real blooming of over-the-counter shops, so physical shops selling crypto in an area of regulatory. It was basically it's an area of gap. It's OTC brokerage, not regulated in Hong Kong. It's the last remaining area of regulation that's not there, and a real concern around that. And so that's why there's now a kind of a sort of completion of that sort of loop of regulation. So it's exchanges, it's brokers, but it's also rules around the existing regulated entities. What I would say is that in the initial phases of Hong Kong's development, there was an interest in banning retail access to virtual assets. And really, I think where Hong Kong came around is that if the controls are so stringent that you cannot realistically access those assets, you can find them anywhere in the world. So you can hop online and you will find them. And so really you're not decreasing risk at all, you're actually increasing risk. And I think having a much more nuanced approach to risk is really important. Having said that, I think one of the most challenging aspects, we've just been working with a lot of exchanges getting through the exchange licensing regime, which is so hard and so costly. It's very hard for those exchanges to make any money. So we get back to the same point, that those exchanges can't make enough money, meaning they need to put their either the margin on trades goes up or fees go up, and again you end up with people going offshore. So it's sort of a global coordinated effort. But overall, I'd say that one of the clearest lessons that comes out of Hong Kong is clarity of regulation, positive signalling, and that's where the banking regulator, I think there's a lot to be said for progress that could be made in Australia. The banking regulator, the HKMA, said to the banks that if we're getting all of these ecosystem participants licensed, you better bank them because they're subject to the same or higher standards. And I think that's a real issue here in Australia that I see banking sector has retreated entirely. And again, you end up with concentration risk and risk generally goes up. So long-winded answer, but basically considered sophisticated regulation, but bearing in mind how you can actually drive up or drive down risk.
Thank you, Urszula. Oh, we have another Deb. Deborah?
Hi, thank you for all your interesting discussion. I guess I go back to something which came up in one of the earlier panels, and Ross talked about the difficulty of sustaining the cash payment services. I've looked at that because it was a merger authorization through the ACCC, which was allowed because they said that the market was declining and they were allowed to merge, and it's declined much more quickly. I'm wondering how you think that will all pan out when you couple that also with the closure of many, many bank branches, and we're looking at the sorts of people who will rely on money are generally the old people who will rely on money. They often don't have mobile phones, they can't use mobile apps. How do we think that's all going to play out going forward? Because I think it's sort of like a perfect storm. The cash transport companies are looking for more money and more money from government and promises. And I'm just wondering, when I look at China, none of the old people have bank accounts anyway. They're all using mobile apps. There aren't banks in a lot of the areas. It's an example of a more exacerbated version of the Australian market. So how do we think it's going to work out in Australia? Thank you.
I was a comment earlier. I think there's this response to one of your comments, Ross, that there is declining cash usage, but that's not because stablecoins or CBDC are playing a role in that at all at the moment. And so, I think if there is a CBDC, it won't end up displacing cash, I think, in my view. It'll end up displacing, the new payments platform payments or credit card payments, which are other kinds of digital payments that people are making. So I think the balance between physical cash and digital payments is I think not going to be driven more. That imbalance won't be driven by having CBDC or stablecoins.
No, I think it might contribute, at least at the margins. There'll be surely some people who trust banks, who trust cash, who will therefore trust CBDC because it's digital cash. But I agree with you broadly. It's not the main driver. The decline in cash use is just because our digital payments are so good and easy and convenient, and I don't have coins rattling around in my pocket and making a nuisance of themselves. I mean, the government and the RBA is strongly committed to the continuation of cash. So how they distribute cash, I mean, I think longer term it'll have to be some sort of utility, or it'll have to be the banks, cooperating. There'll have to be a solution. But I think what's different is the awareness is coming that cash is a vital piece of public infrastructure, and that we haven't thought about it quite in those terms. It's just been like the water that the goldfish swims in, whereas all of a sudden, the water is polluted, or the water is starting to, the level's getting very low. So we have to think about it hard. But it's a very difficult problem. But I agree with you. I mean, my mother's 95 and she can't use a smartphone. So, for as long as she's on a computer, she's all right. But, if she's at the shop, if she doesn't have a credit card, she's,
And in Australia as well, natural disasters and very remote regions with perhaps poor internet access, and it's very hard to use digital forms of payment there. I don't know. I wonder if today, if cash was proposed, if we didn't have cash and it was proposed as a new kind of financial product, it probably wouldn't be approved from kind of KYC, AML, CTF reasons, right? So I think the reason it's around is historical.
Yeah. But what we learned from the day at the RBA, Mark, is it has so many layers of meaning to people. So many different psychological layers, other layers. It's a very big, hairy topic emotionally for people. It's not just about functionality at all.
And internationally, some countries look at CBDC as a way of addressing financial inclusion problems. In Australia, it's not seen that we have a financial inclusion problem in the sense that most people can get a bank account if they want to, except for this financial exclusion problem of fintechs getting debanked, which is a problem in Australia.
Thank you so much. We have questions. Could you please pass the mic? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm George Tian from the UTS, and thank you, Deborah, and organize such a fantastic program. And also, here, actually, I have a question in relation to the issue you just mentioned about the privacy issue in relation to the cryptocurrency and the central bank digital currency in particular. Because I see actually in Australia, when the pilot research have been done, it seems like they try to start with a wholesale level and rather than retail level. And because at retail level, lots of people worry about privacy, just like all the transactions we made, and the central bank and the government will know that. But my question is just like, now when we're dealing with this issue at the cross-border and level, and so if, let's say, any foreign government central bank currency have been used by the Australian citizen, would that also bring the Australians' privacy, citizens' privacy rights in danger in certain degree? Because the current privacy law in Australia basically say all the enterprise in Australia, and when they transfer the resident data overseas and they need to make sure the privacy law in destination provide a several level of protection as the citizen can have in Australia. But when we, let's say the Australian citizen travel overseas and using the central bank currency issued by overseas, but definitely they need to pass all personal information to the foreign bank in the first place. And just a link comment or insight in relation to this?
Yeah. So look, if you use an ECNY, you establish an account with a Hong Kong ID card in the mainland, you assume that, of course, your transactions will be seen. Based on the projects that I've seen for the cross-border side, in general, each market sees its own transactions. So by design, it's not a mutualized access to information, and it's a very sensitive point. There is a question as to whether or not you have at the governance layer some level of oversight to see who's misbehaving, and is a particular market using that infrastructure in a way to, that contravenes principles that they've agreed. But in general, it's by design that each market only sees its own transactions.
Privacy is kind of different people have different understandings what privacy means. Sometimes in the crypto land, they think privacy means no one gets to see my transactions. But from Austrac's point of view, privacy means they get to see all your transactions if they have an authorized kind of reason to. And it's also odd because in blockchain, people think, and regulators are concerned about, for example, Bitcoin being too private, and yet all the transactions are fully public. And in fact, it's too open, too transparent for companies to use in many cases because they don't get the right level of commercial confidentiality they need from those transaction networks. So it's an odd mix of sort of paradoxes at the moment.
So just one project to watch is Project Aurum. So that's the Hong Kong project with BAS that's testing zero-knowledge proofs and other privacy-enhancing techniques. But that one's a really exciting one because that's generally altogether limiting the information that is shared altogether. Sorry, I pronounced it better.
Those of us who did the chemistry lessons will spell it very easily. I don't see any more questions. Joni, is there anything you wanted to comment in the Q&A, or I'm just mindful that we're not leaving you out of the discussion.
Oh, was that a question to me or to the audience?
Is there anything you wanted to add to these comments that we were just raised or made?
Just a very quick closing comment to say that I disagree with respectfully the definition of token adopted by the ISO, that it comprises of entitlements, like the rights to deal with a balance of crypto tokens can have underlying entitlements but also obligations, and so because there are multiple different activities possible with a single crypto token standard, whether it's a fungible token standard or a non-fungible or semi-fungible, I disagree with that definition respectfully, and am constantly having to spend many more words in the plain language terms and conditions, which Mark so lovely referred to as the paperwork, but to just set the expectations out for all of the different stakeholders and types of users that come to a particular token activity or platform or relationship. And all of that always needs to be unpacked because the definitions prevailing of digital asset and of token just are not cutting the mustard. So I would encourage everybody to continue to look at those not as it might be an ISO standard, but certainly not practical in the way that we draft in contracts and terms and conditions and so forth in industry. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Joni. And I want to conclude with a very quick blitz with responses 30 seconds to 1 minute, not more than that. One question to everybody in whichever order. Pick one problem, technology or law regulation related, doesn't matter. That's dealing with CBDC, applying cross-border, or tokenizing real-world assets that hasn't been resolved and should be addressed as a priority, number one priority for you. Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I would say remittances. I'd say remittances in our part of the world because the technology makes the resolution so easy, and the social justice upside would be so marked. There's such a big gain to be had. And the research says remittance flows work better than aid in a lot of contexts for developing countries. So that'd be the one that I'd start with.
Thank you, Ross.
We haven't talked a lot about stablecoins or tokenized bank deposits today, but I think they are probably much more prospective as a settlement instrument for buying tokenized things. CBDC may or may not come, but stablecoins are already here. But I think in a world where you have many stablecoins and there are KYC requirements per stablecoin, and that if I have a bank stablecoin and I want to buy something from you, but you're not a customer of my bank, are you going to accept the stablecoin? So this whole challenge of, you talked about a KYC utility. Yeah. So that something like that is needed to enable stablecoin interoperability. I mean, the interoperability might be technically not too hard, but that's technology is not going to solve that KYC problem. So we need KYC portability or something like that.
Thank you. Urszula and Joni.
For me, it's trust. And what I mean by that is, from a CBDC perspective, I think one of the greatest shames is how much distrust there is in government. And what I mean by that is not in principle that it isn't a fair distrust, but more that we don't focus on the institutions and checks and balances that would engender trust. So what is the by design checks and balances that would earn the trust in launching something like this, that it wouldn't be abused?
Thank you. And Joni, what's your number one problem that needs to be addressed?
Well, I think it would be the legal reform to clarify an Aussie dollar pegged stablecoin, privately issued stablecoin, what the regulations are around that, and what if those regulations are met, that it can have currency or currency equivalent status when it is used to make payments, so that it's more like it's easy for me to launch a Shopify-like website because the payments is just an integration. I don't need a payments license to do an e-commerce business and sell digital goods. I think if we have privately issued stablecoin regulation and that currency equivalent status, that unlocks private sector innovation, as well as industry-wide innovation, and the government side can experience the efficiency dividend of being able to receive stablecoin, automated calculation and payment of tax-related liabilities. So government benefits and private sector benefits at the same time. That's me.
Thank you. And with that, I declare this panel is over, and invite you to thank everyone.